November 17, 1558. A queen lies dying in darkness. Her skin is turning black. She's completely blind. And she's utterly alone. Mary Tudor, England's first crowned queen, is only 42 years old. Her household of 400 servants has fled down to just 50. Her husband abandoned her years ago. Her belly, swollen twice with phantom babies that never existed, now blackens with necrosis as her flesh rots while she still breathes. If you want to witness how power, betrayal, and the human body can create the darkest chapter in Tudor history, you need to see what happens next. This is the story they tried to bury. It began with hope. In the autumn of 1554, Queen Mary Tudor made an announcement that should have secured her reign forever. She was pregnant. At 38 years old, after marrying the younger, handsome Philip of Spain just months earlier, England's first crowned queen would finally produce a Catholic heir. The signs were unmistakable. Her belly swelled, pushing against the tight bodices of her gowns. Her breasts grew tender and enlarged. Waves of nausea struck her each morning. And then, the most convincing proof of all, she felt movement. Small flutters at first, then stronger kicks that she would place courtiers' hands upon to feel. By April 1555, Mary entered her confinement. According to royal tradition, she withdrew into darkened chambers at Hampton Court Palace, waiting for labor to begin. Letters were drafted announcing the prince's arrival, ready to be sent across Europe. Days turned into weeks. Mary waited. The royal physicians waited. The entire kingdom held its breath. But something was wrong. Mary began exhibiting strange behaviors that terrified her ladies-in-waiting. She would curl into a tight ball on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, rocking back and forth for hours. She sobbed uncontrollably, refusing food, refusing light. For a woman supposedly 9 months pregnant, the position was physically impossible. Yet there she lay, day after day, in the fetal position herself, as if mimicking the child she believed grew inside her. May arrived. Then June. No labor pains came. No child emerged. Slowly, quietly, the swelling in her abdomen began to shrink. The movement stopped. The nausea faded. By August 1555, Mary emerged from her confinement chambers, pale and hollow-eyed, with no baby in her arms. No official announcement was ever made. The drafted letters were burned. The tiny gowns packed away. Whispers spread through the courts of Europe. The Queen of England had never been pregnant at all. Modern medicine has a name for what Mary experienced: pseudocyesis, or phantom pregnancy. It's a condition where a woman exhibits every symptom of pregnancy: swelling, nausea, even the sensation of fetal movement, without an actual child developing in the womb. The mind, desperate for pregnancy, convinces the body to mimic it. But Mary's case went deeper than psychological desire. Medical historians now believe a tumor was growing on her pituitary gland, causing hormonal chaos that made her body simulate pregnancy while her womb remained empty. The cruelest twist? It happened again. In 1557, Mary announced a second pregnancy. This time, nobody believed her. Not the court, not the physicians, not even Philip, who had already begun making plans to leave England. When her belly swelled once more, it was dismissed as delusion. When she spoke of feeling the baby move, attendants exchanged knowing glances and said nothing. Mary Tudor's body had betrayed her in the most profound way imaginable, and this betrayal was only the beginning of how her flesh would turn against her in the years to come. What Mary did not know, what no one in the 16th century could have known, was that something had been growing inside her for decades. Not a child. Something far more sinister. Since the age of 14, Mary had suffered from what Tudor physicians called strangulation of the womb. Her monthly cycles would vanish for months at a time, then return with crippling pain that left her bedridden. Crushing headaches struck without warning. so severe that she would lie in darkened rooms with cold cloths pressed to her forehead, unable to tolerate even candlelight. Her abdomen would swell and harden, distended as though she'd swallowed stones. The royal doctors prescribed everything from bloodletting to herbal poultices. Nothing worked. The symptoms only worsened as she aged. Deep within Mary's skull, invisible to every eye and instrument of her time, a tumor was growing on her pituitary gland. This tiny mass of abnormal tissue, no larger than a grape, was slowly destroying her from within. The tumor secreted prolactin, a hormone that flooded her system and wreaked havoc on her body's delicate balance. Her breasts began producing milk, despite never having given birth. Her eyebrows thinned and fell out in patches. Weight accumulated around her middle, no matter how little she ate. Waves of confusion would wash over her during council meetings, leaving her struggling to remember what had been discussed moments before. Depression settled over her like a funeral shroud, deeper and darker than any grief. But the most devastating effect was yet to come. As the tumor expanded, it began pressing against the optic nerves that carried sight from her eyes to her brain. The pressure was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Colors seemed less vivid. Faces became slightly blurred at the edges. Mary assumed it was simply the natural dimming that came with age. By her early 40s, she could no longer read the prayer books she cherished without holding them at arm's length. Courtiers noticed she would squint when trying to identify someone across a room. She began relying on voices rather than faces to recognize people around her. A darkness was closing in. Yet the pituitary tumor was not working alone. Medical historians examining the documented symptoms of Maria's final year believe something else had taken root in her reproductive organs. The persistent abdominal swelling, the waves of pain, the yellowing of her skin all point to cancer, likely originating in her ovaries or uterus and spreading to her liver. By 1558, Mary's abdomen contained nearly 2 gallons of fluid, a condition called ascites that occurs when tumors disrupt the body's ability to regulate fluid balance. Her belly, which had twice swollen with phantom children, was now grotesquely distended with the accumulated poison of her failing organs. Multiple diseases were consuming her simultaneously. The pituitary tumor pressed harder against her optic nerves. The cancer metastasized through her abdomen. And Mary, trapped inside a body turning hostile, had no way of understanding why everything she touched seemed to crumble her fertility, her marriage, her vision, and soon her very life. The worst, however, was still ahead. The new year of 1558 opened with catastrophe. In January, England lost Calais, the last remaining English possession on continental Europe, held for over 200 years. French forces captured the strategic port in just 8 days of fighting. When the news reached Mary, she reportedly said that when she died, they would find Calais engraved upon her heart. The loss shattered what remained of her fragile spirit. England blamed her. They blamed her Spanish marriage, her foreign policies, her weakness. The whispers in the streets of London were merciless. Bloody Mary had not only failed to produce an heir, she had lost England's gateway to the continent. As winter melted into spring, a virulent influenza epidemic swept across the country. It killed with the speed and ruthlessness of plague, dropping victims within days. The streets of London reeked with funeral pyres. Entire households were decimated, and in the palace, the queen, already weakened by years of illness, fell victim to the fever. The infection hit her hard. Unlike common subjects who either died quickly or recovered, Mary lingered in a twilight state. The fever would spike, leaving her drenched in sweat and delirious, then break for a day or two before returning with renewed vengeance. Sleep became impossible. She would lie awake through endless nights, listening to her own labored breathing, feeling the fire burn beneath her skin. Her physicians, Dr. Thomas Wendy and Dr. Thomas Hick, attended her constantly, but their treatments were medieval. More bloodletting, more purgatives, more prayers. Nothing brought relief. The melancholia that had plagued her since the phantom pregnancies deepened into something far darker. She stopped eating for days at a time. When attendants forced broth between her lips, she would turn her face away like a stubborn child. By August, the decision was made to move her from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace in London. The journey, though short, exhausted her completely. Courtiers who saw her being transported whispered in horror at how frail she'd become. Her face had taken on a waxy, yellowish pallor. Her eyes, once sharp and intelligent, had dulled to near blindness. She had to be guided by the hand like an elderly woman, though she was only 42 years old. At St. James's, Mary was installed in chambers that seemed to shrink around her as the weeks passed. The headaches intensified until even the softest footstep felt like a hammer against her skull. She could no longer distinguish faces. Everyone became shifting shadows and blurred shapes. Documents requiring her signature had to be held inches from her nose, and even then, she often signed in the wrong place. The dropsy worsened. Her legs swelled grotesquely, the flesh retaining the imprint of fingers when pressed. Her abdomen continued its relentless expansion, tight as a drum. Waves of nausea struck randomly, leaving her retching into basins held by tight-lipped attendants. September arrived with no improvement. If anything, the periods of confusion grew longer. She would wake disoriented, calling for people long dead, forgetting where she was or what year it was. And through it all, one absence burned more painfully than any physical symptom. Philip had not come. Her husband had not returned. And soon, Mary would discover just how completely she had been abandoned. Philip of Spain had left England in July 1557. Shortly after Mary's second phantom pregnancy humiliated them both before the courts of Europe. He told her it was temporary. He had urgent matters to attend to in the Netherlands, affairs of state that required his personal attention. He promised to return. He never did. Mary wrote to him constantly, desperate, pleading letters begging him to come back to England, to her bed, to give her one more chance at the child she so desperately craved. His replies, when they came at all, were brief and formal. He addressed her more like a political ally than a wife, discussing treaties and military matters while ignoring her personal entreaties entirely. The truth was brutal. Philip had married Mary for England's alliance, not for love. Once it became clear her womb would produce no heir, she held no further value to him. He was 11 years younger, with decades of fertile years ahead. Why waste time with a barren, sickly wife when he could seek more advantageous matches elsewhere? When news of Mary's death finally reached Philip in November 1558, his response was chilling in its indifference. "I felt a reasonable regret," he wrote. Reasonable. As if mourning his wife of 4 years warranted only a measured, appropriate amount of grief. Nothing excessive, nothing genuine. But Philip's abandonment, though deeply personal, was only one desertion among many. Mary's royal household had once numbered over 400 people. Nobles, ladies-in-waiting, secretaries, chaplains, physicians, servants of every rank, all the machinery required to operate a Tudor court. They had flocked to her during the triumphant early years of her reign, eager for positions, for favor, for proximity to power. Now, as autumn 1558 descended and Mary's condition became visibly terminal, they began to vanish. At first, it was subtle. A noble would beg leave to attend to urgent matters on his country estate. A lady-in-waiting would plead illness in her family. Excuses multiplied. The chambers of St. James's Palace, once bustling with activity, grew quieter each week. The courtiers weren't retiring to their homes. They were riding hard for Hatfield House, where 25-year-old Princess Elizabeth waited in barely concealed anticipation. Elizabeth healthy, young, Protestant, and very much alive. The court could read the future clearly. Mary was dying. Elizabeth would be queen. Anyone with ambition knew where to place their loyalty. By late October, fewer than 50 attendants remained at Mary's side. The once grand royal household had been reduced to a skeleton crew, a handful of faithful old servants who had nowhere else to go, a few physicians bound by professional duty, and those too poor or powerless to secure positions with Elizabeth. Mary was dying in a palace that had become a ghost of itself. Empty corridors echoed with her labored breathing. Chambers that once hosted elaborate ceremonies now stood dark and unused. Even the guards had thinned, slipping away to join Elizabeth's swelling retinue. The Queen of England, the first woman to be crowned sovereign in her own right, lay in her chambers at St. James's Palace, nearly blind, racked with fever, and almost completely alone. And then her body began to turn black. The first dark patches appeared sometime in late September. A lady-in-waiting noticed them while helping Mary dress small discolorations on the Queen's lower back, almost like bruises. Within days, similar marks emerged on her feet and around the distended curve of her belly. At first, the physicians dismissed them as common bruising from her weakened state. Bedridden patients often developed such marks from lying in one position too long. But these bruises behaved strangely. Instead of fading from purple to yellow, as normal bruises do, they deepened. Purple became a darker purple, then an unsettling shade between brown and black, and they were spreading. By early October, what had begun as scattered patches had merged into larger areas of discolored flesh. The skin around these regions felt different to the touch cooler than the surrounding tissue, slightly hardened. When Mary's attendants changed her nightgown, they had to steel themselves against the shock of what they saw. The Queen's body was developing continents of darkness, mapped across her failing flesh. Contemporary accounts described the discoloration in careful, horrified language. One observer wrote that her skin appeared bruised and rotten in places. Another noted that portions of her body had turned almost black, as if burned. These weren't metaphors or exaggerations. They were accurate descriptions of necrosis, the death of living tissue while the person still breathes. Necrosis occurs when blood flow to an area is cut off, starving the cells of oxygen. Without oxygen, tissue begins to die. The process follows a predictable pattern. The skin turns red as the body tries to compensate, then purple as oxygen levels drop, then black as the cells completely die and begin to decompose. In Mary's case, the likely causes were multiple. Her tumors may have been pressing on blood vessels, her weakened heart couldn't pump efficiently, and infection may have invaded her compromised immune system. What makes necrosis particularly horrifying is that it happens while the person remains fully conscious. Mary could feel the affected areas growing cold and numb. She could sense, even through her near blindness, that something was terribly wrong with her body. When attendants cleaned the areas with vinegar and rose water, the only treatment available in the 16th century, she would flinch and cry out. Some areas had lost feeling entirely. Others remained excruciatingly sensitive. The blackening tissue marked her as someone already touched by death. In an era when the condition of one's body was often seen as a reflection of one's soul, the visual horror of Mary's necrosis carried terrible implications. Whispers circulated among the few remaining servants. Was this divine punishment? A curse? The physical manifestation of her sins? Mary herself must have known what it meant. She had attended enough deathbeds to recognize the signs. When flesh turns black and begins to rot before death arrives, the end is not far off. There would be no recovery, no miraculous reversal. Her body was decomposing around her, piece by piece, while her heart still beat and her lungs still drew breath. The darkness on her skin was spreading, and soon it would bring companions even more unbearable: the unmistakable scent of death and the complete extinction of light from her eyes. With the blackening came an odor that no amount of rose water or burning incense could mask. Necrotizing tissue doesn't die quietly. As cells break down, bacteria that normally live harmlessly on the skin seize their opportunity. They infiltrate the dying flesh and begin their work of decomposition. The result is a smell that anyone who has encountered it never forgets sweet, rotten, and unmistakably organic. It's the smell of a body beginning to decay while the person inside it still lives. Mary's attendants burned lavender and rosemary in her chambers constantly. They changed the rushes on the floor twice daily instead of weekly. They sprinkled dried flowers across every surface. Nothing helped. The scent clung to the bed curtains, soaked into the tapestries, followed the queen like an invisible shadow announcing her approach. But the blackening skin was only one aspect of her physical disintegration. Mary's hair, once thick and reddish gold like her father's, had thinned dramatically. It came out in clumps when her ladies tried to brush it, leaving bald patches across her scalp. They took to arranging her headdresses carefully to conceal the worst of it, but even that became difficult as she grew too weak to sit upright for long. Her face had transformed into something skeletal. The cheeks that had once been pleasantly round hollowed out, making her cheekbones jut sharply beneath papery skin. Her eyes sank deep into their sockets, creating dark caverns that made her look decades older than her 42 years. The vibrant woman who had ridden into London 5 years earlier to claim her throne had become a figure that frightened children and made grown men cross themselves. The weight loss happened with frightening speed during October. Pounds melted away as she could barely keep down even broth. Her wrists became twigs. Her collarbones protruded like knife edges. Yet paradoxically, her abdomen continued to swell with fluid, creating a grotesque contrast, a skeletal frame with a massively distended belly, as if she carried some monstrous pregnancy to term. Then came the jaundice. Her skin, already pale and marked with black patches, took on a sickly yellow tinge. The whites of her nearly blind eyes turned the color of old parchment. Her urine darkened to the shade of strong tea. These were the unmistakable signs of liver failure, the cancer that had likely originated in her reproductive organs was now destroying her liver's ability to process waste. The pain during these weeks must have been excruciating, yet Mary rarely cried out. She had been raised to believe that royal dignity required silent suffering. When the pain became unbearable, she would clench her teeth until her jaw trembled and press her fists into the mattress until her knuckles whitened. Only occasionally would a low moan escape her lips, quickly stifled. The vomiting became more frequent. Sometimes it was the broth she'd managed to swallow. Other times, bile. And on the worst days, dark matter that her physicians recognized with dread. Mary Tudor was trapped in a horror beyond medieval understanding, conscious and aware, as her body consumed itself from the inside out. Yet even this nightmare had one more cruelty to inflict. The darkness spreading across her skin was about to spread across her vision as well, plunging her into a night that would never end. By mid-October, Mary could no longer see faces. The tumor pressing against her optic nerves had finally completed its slow strangulation of her vision. The world had been fading for months, colors washing out, edges blurring, light growing dimmer. Now it collapsed entirely into darkness. The transition from near blindness to total blindness happened over the course of several days. First, she lost the ability to perceive depth. Reaching for a cup, her hand would grasp at empty air. Attendants had to guide her fingers to objects she sought. Then shapes dissolved into indistinct shadows. A person standing by the window became merely a darker patch against gray. Finally, even the distinction between light and dark vanished. Whether her eyes were open or closed made no difference. The world was black. For a woman who had loved reading her prayer books, who had pored over documents of state, who had watched her father's court with sharp, intelligent eyes, the loss was devastating. The beautifully illuminated books of hours she cherished, those pages decorated with gold leaf and intricate paintings of saints, were now just leather and parchment she could only touch, never see again. The prayers she had memorized since childhood became her only remaining access to the devotions that had sustained her through years of suffering. Her attendants had to describe everything to her now. "Your Majesty, Lady Susan approaches from your left." Dr. Wendy is preparing your medicine at the table. It is morning, though the sky is overcast. Mary's world shrank to what people chose to tell her, and she knew with the paranoia of the very ill that they were editing reality, hiding things from her. She began identifying people solely by voice. When someone entered her chamber, she would lie perfectly still, listening, waiting for them to speak before acknowledging their presence. Sometimes she would call out a name hopefully, only to be gently corrected. "No, Your Majesty, it is not Lady Jane. It is Anne." The disorientation was constant. Without sight to anchor her, Mary would forget where she was in her own chambers. She might wake from fever dreams believing herself at Hampton Court or Greenwich, calling for rooms and people that weren't there. Her ladies would have to reorient her patiently. "You are at St. James's, Your Majesty, in your bedchamber. I am here beside you." Perhaps most cruel was that Mary could not see the concern or lack thereof on the faces around her. She couldn't read the expressions of her physicians when they examined her and found nothing they could treat. She couldn't see whether her attendants looked at her with pity or revulsion. She couldn't catch the furtive glances exchanged between servants when they thought she wasn't paying attention. The blindness imprisoned her more effectively than any locked door. She was trapped in darkness, in a bed she couldn't leave, in a body that was killing her, surrounded by people she could hear but not see. Every sound became magnified footsteps in the corridor, whispered conversations she couldn't quite make out, the rustle of fabric as someone moved away from her bedside. And in that darkness, with nothing but her thoughts and the relentless pain of her failing body, Mary's mind began turning against her as savagely as her flesh already had. Trapped in darkness, Mary's mind began constructing threats from every shadow she could no longer see. It started with the food. One evening in late October, a servant brought her usual broth, and Mary turned her face away, refusing it. When her lady-in-waiting pressed her gently, asking why she wouldn't eat, Mary whispered hoarsely, "How do I know it hasn't been poisoned?" The fear wasn't entirely irrational. Her half-sister Elizabeth waited at Hatfield, and much of the court had already defected to her side. Throughout Tudor history, poison had been a favored method for disposing of inconvenient royals. Mary had lived through plots, rebellions, and assassination attempts. Now, blind and helpless, she couldn't see who prepared her food or what hands it passed through before reaching her lips. She began insisting that only specific goblets be used for her drinks, and only certain trusted servants could bring them. Even then, she would sometimes hold the cup to her nose, sniffing suspiciously before taking the smallest sip. Meals became exercises in negotiation, with attendants coaxing her like a frightened child to swallow just a few spoonfuls. Sleep, which might have offered escape from her waking nightmare, became another enemy. The insomnia was relentless. Hour after hour, she would lie in the darkness, a darkness identical whether her eyes were open or closed, listening to her own labored breathing, feeling the fire of fever burn through her veins. The pain gave her no rest. When exhaustion finally dragged her under, fever dreams would jolt her awake within minutes, leaving her gasping and disoriented. The cycles of her illness created their own special torture. The fever would spike for days, leaving her delirious and barely conscious. Then, just when death seemed imminent, it would break. For a few precious hours, sometimes a full day, Mary would experience a cruel clarity. She would wake lucid, the pain momentarily dulled, and in those moments she understood exactly what was happening to her. She was dying, slowly, painfully, publicly, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Those periods of lucidity were perhaps worse than the delirium. During fever dreams, she could lose herself in confusion, mistake the present for the past, believe herself somewhere else. But when the fever broke and her mind cleared, she had to confront the full horror of her situation. Blind abandoned her body rotting, while she still breathed her court, fled to her rival, her husband gone, her womb forever empty. The depression that settled over her during these lucid periods was so profound that her physicians noted it in their records. They observed that her mental anguish seemed to accelerate her physical decline. When she sank into despair, refusing to speak or eat, her body weakened faster. It was as if she was willing herself to die, trying to hurry the end that was taking so agonizingly long to arrive. Yet even as Mary descended into paranoia and despair, even as her body betrayed her in every possible way, she clung to one thing, her faith. Soon, that faith would offer her something unexpected in her final days' visions that would either be dismissed as fever-induced hallucinations or remembered as divine mercy granted to a suffering soul. But first, November would arrive, bringing with it the end. November arrived with an unexpected mercy. For a few brief days at the beginning of the month, Mary experienced what physicians call a rally, a temporary improvement that sometimes occurs just before death. The fever receded slightly. Her mind cleared. The constant pain dulled to a manageable ache rather than an all-consuming agony. In those lucid hours, Mary knew exactly what needed to be done. She summoned her advisors on November 8th and made the decision she had avoided for months. She would formally name Elizabeth as her successor. There was no other choice, no Catholic heir waited in the wings, no alternative that wouldn't plunge England into civil war. The Protestant half-sister she had once imprisoned, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who represented everything Mary had fought against, would inherit the throne. Mary dictated a codicil to her will, with Dr. Thomas Wendy as witness. Her voice was weak, but her instructions were clear. She requested that Elizabeth maintain the Catholic faith in England, a request everyone in the room knew would be ignored the moment Mary's heart stopped beating. Still, she had to try. It was all she had left. The codicil completed, Mary had no more state business to conduct. Her reign was effectively over. All that remained was the wait. The brief rally collapsed as quickly as it had come. By November 10th, Mary had slipped back into the cycle of fever and unconsciousness. But now the unconscious periods lasted longer hours at a time when she would lie motionless, her breathing so shallow that attendants would lean close to check if she still lived. When she woke, it was often with violent convulsions that left her body rigid and her few remaining servants helpless. They could only hold her down gently, trying to prevent her from injuring herself, until the paroxysm passed and she collapsed back into the sweat-soaked bedding. Edith Bredeman, an elderly servant who had been with Mary since her childhood, rarely left her bedside now. While younger, more ambitious attendants had fled to Elizabeth, old Edith remained. She had nowhere else to go, and perhaps more importantly, she remembered Mary not as the failed queen dying in darkness, but as the little princess she had once helped dress for court. She held Mary's hand during the worst moments, spoke soothingly during episodes of confusion, and wiped the sweat from her forehead with infinite gentleness. The handful of other faithful servants maintained a vigil in the outer chambers, speaking in whispers, jumping at every sound from the royal bedroom. They knew these were the final days. The question was no longer if Mary would die, but when and whether she would achieve the peaceful, holy death she desperately wanted. Solid food was no longer even attempted. The attendants would carefully spoon thin broth between Mary's lips, tilting her head slightly to help her swallow. Sometimes she managed a few swallows before turning away weakly. Other times, the broth would come back up within minutes, leaving her gasping and exhausted from the effort. The death watch had begun in earnest. The physicians could offer nothing more. The priests prayed constantly. And Mary, drifting between consciousness and oblivion, waited for the end. But before death would claim her, she would experience something that would be debated for centuries, visions that seemed to transport her briefly beyond the darkness and pain of her dying body. On November 13th, 4 days before her death, something extraordinary happened in Mary's darkened chamber. She had been lying silent for hours, her breathing labored but steady, when suddenly she spoke. Her voice, though weak, carried a clarity it hadn't possessed in weeks. "Do you see them?" She asked the attendants at her bedside. The women exchanged uncertain glances. "See what, Your Majesty?" "The children," Mary whispered, and for the first time in months, something like wonder entered her voice. "Like little angels. They're playing all around us." One of her ladies leaned closer, concerned this was another fever-induced delusion. But Mary wasn't thrashing or confused. She lay peacefully, her blind eyes open, but seeing something far beyond the physical walls of St. James's Palace. A faint smile crossed her wasted face and expression her attendants hadn't witnessed since, before the phantom pregnancies destroyed her hopes. "They're singing," Mary continued, her voice growing softer, more distant. "Such beautiful voices. Like the choir at Mass, but sweeter, pure." She described the children in remarkable detail for someone who could no longer see the world around her. They wore white, she said, and moved with impossible grace. They weren't frightening or sorrowful, but joyful, laughing and playing as children do, yet with an otherworldly quality that marked them as something more than mortal. For nearly an hour, Mary spoke intermittently about what she was experiencing. Between descriptions, she would fall silent, seemingly entranced by whatever visions played before her blind eyes. The attendants didn't know how to respond. Was this the final deterioration of a mind broken by suffering? Or was their dying queen being granted a glimpse of heaven as a mercy for her years of devotion? The visions brought Mary profound comfort. In the days following, whenever she was lucid enough to speak, she would reference them. "I have seen such joyous things," she told old Edith Bredeman. "Dreams that feel more real than anything in this world. The children showed me I need not be afraid." Her physicians, trained in the rational medicine of the Renaissance, noted the visions in their records with clinical detachment. Patients near death often experienced hallucinations, they knew. Fever, pain, and the body's shutdown could create vivid mental imagery. The brain, starved of oxygen and overwhelmed by illness, might conjure comforting illusions as a final kindness. But Mary's Catholic attendants interpreted the visions differently. Here was a queen who had suffered tremendously for her faith, who had restored Catholicism to England despite enormous opposition, who had endured mockery and betrayal while clinging to her beliefs. Why wouldn't God grant her a vision of heaven's inhabitants as she approached death? Why wouldn't angels appear to comfort a soul that would soon join them? The debate would continue for centuries. Fever dream or divine visitation? Neurological misfiring or miraculous intervention? Perhaps the answer mattered less than the effect. For the first time since her body began its final collapse, Mary Tudor experienced something other than pain and fear. She experienced peace. But that peace would be tested one final time. The rituals of death still awaited, the confession that must be made, the last rites that must be received. Mary's faith demanded one more act of will from her failing body, one more conscious moment before she could finally let go. Evening fell on November 16th, and Mary made a request that surprised no one who knew her. Despite her weakness, despite barely clinging to consciousness, she insisted on making her final confession. She could not die without unburdening her soul one last time. Father John Feckenham, the abbot of Westminster and Mary's longtime confessor, was summoned to her bedside. He had been a constant presence during her reign, one of the few men she trusted completely. Now he would hear the last confession of England's first crowned queen. The attendants withdrew to give them privacy, though they remained close enough to hear the low murmur of voices through the heavy bed curtains. Feckenham settled beside Mary's bed, leaning close so she could hear his gentle prompting. Even in extremis, even blind and dying, Mary was determined to follow the proper forms of the sacrament she had fought so hard to restore to England. The confession lasted for hours. What sins did Mary Tudor confess in those final moments? The burnings of Protestant heretics that would earn her the name Bloody Mary for centuries to come? The failure to produce an heir? The marriage to Philip that many considered a betrayal of England? The loss of Calais? Whatever passed between the dying queen and her priest, remained sealed by the sanctity of the confessional. But those listening outside noted something remarkable. As Mary spoke, unburdening her conscience, her voice grew stronger. The act of confession seemed to revive her, at least temporarily. This was what she had lived for, the rituals and sacraments of the Catholic faith that had sustained her through decades of persecution, humiliation, and loss. Now, at the very end, her faith gave her the strength to push back death for a few more hours. Feckenham prayed with her, his voice steady and comforting in the darkness. He recited the prayers Mary had known since childhood, the Latin phrases that had been forbidden during her brother Edward's Protestant reign, the same prayers she had risked her life to practice in secret. Now she could hear them openly one final time, spoken by a priest at her deathbed, exactly as Catholic tradition demanded. When the confession finally ended, Feckenham emerged with tears streaming down his face. He told the waiting attendants that the Queen was at peace, her soul prepared for what was coming. She had asked him to remain close through the night. She wanted a priest present when the end came. Mary lay back against her pillows, exhausted by the effort, but spiritually fortified. She had done what needed to be done. Her sins were confessed, her soul shriven. Whatever awaited her beyond death, she would face it in a state of grace. But her body had one more ordeal to endure before it would release her. The longest night of her life was about to begin, a night that would end only with the dawn and the final merciful silence. The hours between midnight and morning would test everything Mary had left, both physically and spiritually. And in those hours, she would experience one last moment of grace, so unexpected that witnesses would record it with trembling hands, uncertain whether to believe their own eyes. At midnight on November 17th, Father Feckenham administered the last rites, the sacrament of extreme unction, the final anointing that would prepare Mary's soul for its journey beyond death. He anointed her forehead, her eyelids, her lips, her hands. The holy oil traced ancient symbols on skin that had already begun its transformation from life to death. Mary could no longer respond verbally, but her lips moved slightly, forming the prayer she knew by heart. Each breath came harder now, a rattling struggle that her few remaining attendants recognized as the sound of approaching death. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched into an eternity. Mary drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes making small sounds of distress, other times lying so still that Edith would lean close to check if she still breathed. The room was silent except for those labored breaths, the rustle of fabric as attendants shifted positions, and the whispered prayers from Father Feckenham's steady vigil. As dawn approached, it was decided that Mass should be celebrated in the Queen's chamber. Even if Mary couldn't respond, couldn't participate in the way she had loved all her life, she could be present for one final Mass. It was the greatest comfort they could offer her. Father Feckenham began the ritual around 5 in the morning. The familiar Latin phrases filled the darkened room. The attendants responded at the appropriate moments, their voices hushed, aware they were witnessing something profound, the last Mass that would ever be celebrated for Mary Tudor while she still lived. Then came the elevation of the host, the moment when the priest raises the consecrated bread, transformed by Catholic doctrine into the literal body of Christ. It is the most sacred moment of the Mass, the instant when heaven touches earth. Feckenham lifted the host high, and Mary saw it. The woman who had been completely blind for weeks, who couldn't distinguish light from darkness, who hadn't seen a human face in over a month. Mary saw the consecrated host, her blind eyes fixed upon it with unmistakable recognition. Her lips parted. A sound escaped her throat that might have been prayer or wonder. The attendants witnessed it. Father Feckenham witnessed it. In the centuries since, skeptics would argue it was impossible, that the witnesses were mistaken or lying or caught up in religious fervor. But they recorded what they saw. Mary Tudor, in her final moments, somehow perceived the one thing her faith held most sacred. Minutes later, somewhere between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Mary's breathing changed. The rattling stopped. Each breath grew shallower, softer, further apart. There was no dramatic struggle, no final words. Just a gradual fading, like a candle burning down to nothing. One breath, then another, weaker still, then a longer pause. The attendants held their own breath, waiting. The next breath never came. Mary Tudor, Queen of England, was dead at 42 years old. She had reigned for 5 years and 4 months. And now, in the silence of that November morning, her suffering was finally over. But her story, the story of how England would remember her, how she would be buried, and what would become of her legacy, was just beginning its final, tragic chapter. The room remained silent for several moments after Mary's final breath. The attendants stood frozen, perhaps waiting for one more gasp, one more sign of life that would never come. Father Feckenham closed his prayer book slowly, made the sign of the cross over her body, and bowed his head. England's first crowned queen was dead, and the machinery of succession began moving with startling speed. Within minutes, someone, likely one of the physicians, removed the heavy coronation ring from Mary's finger. This ring, placed on her hand during her coronation 5 years earlier, was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of her marriage to England itself, a physical representation of royal authority. Removing it while her body was still warm felt brutally efficient, but necessity demanded speed. Elizabeth needed to know immediately. Nicholas Throckmorton, one of the few nobles who had remained at St. James's Palace, was already prepared to ride. He had been waiting for this moment, his horse saddled, knowing that whoever brought Elizabeth the news would secure favor with the new queen. As soon as Mary's death was confirmed, he mounted and galloped northwest toward Hatfield House, the coronation ring secured in his pouch as proof. The ride would take hours. While Throckmorton rode, the attendants in Mary's chamber began the grim work required by custom and climate. A body couldn't simply lie in state, not in November, not with the decomposition that had already begun before death. The embalmers needed to work quickly. Mary's body was washed and prepared with spices, cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatics meant to preserve the flesh and mask any odor. Given the state of her body at death, with its patches of necrotic tissue and the swelling from accumulated fluid, the embalmers faced a challenging task. They worked with professional detachment, treating the remains before them as the shell of a soul already departed. Once embalmed, Mary's body was wrapped in cerecloth fabric soaked in wax and spices and placed in a lead coffin. Lead was essential for royal burials, creating an airtight seal that would contain the body indefinitely. The lead coffin was then enclosed in a wooden outer coffin, creating a double barrier between the dead queen and the world. A funeral effigy was commissioned immediately. These wooden figures, dressed in the deceased's finest robes and wearing a wax or wooden mask modeled on their face, served as stand-ins during the lying-in state. The actual body, sealed in lead, would remain unseen. The effigy would receive the mourner's gazes, preserving the queen's dignity while her mortal remains rested hidden. Mary's effigy was carved with care, a representation of her as she had been at her coronation, not as she had appeared in death. They dressed it in royal purple trimmed with ermine, placed a scepter in one hand and an orb in the other. The wax face, painted in lifelike colors, showed none of the suffering that had marked her final months. This was the Mary Tudor they wanted remembered, regal, dignified, untouched by the horrors of her dying. Meanwhile, miles away at Hatfield, Elizabeth sat beneath an oak tree, reading. She looked up when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Throckmorton dismounted, breathing hard from the fast ride, and knelt before her. He held out the ring. Elizabeth took the ring from Throckmorton's outstretched hand. According to legend, she quoted Psalm 118 in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Then she stood, smoothed her skirts, and began issuing orders. She was queen now. But first, her predecessor required a proper burial. Mary's body remained at St. James's Palace for nearly a month while preparations were made. The lead coffin, with its wooden outer casing, rested in the chapel royal. The effigy stood watch above it, candles burning continuously. A handful of clergy maintained vigil, praying for her soul in the Catholic manner she would have wanted. On December 13th, the procession began. Mary's coffin was transported from St. James's to Westminster Abbey through London streets lined with crowds. Some wept genuinely, remembering the brave princess who had ridden into London to claim her throne against impossible odds. Others watched silently, already looking toward the Protestant future that Elizabeth promised. The coffin traveled slowly, carried by yeomen of the guard, followed by a somber procession of nobles, clergy, and what remained of Mary's household. The funeral itself took place on December 14, 1558, exactly 1 month after her sister's death. Westminster Abbey filled with bishops in full ceremonial vestments, nobles in black mourning clothes, and representatives from across England. This would be the last royal funeral celebrated according to the full Roman Catholic rite that England would witness for centuries. Father John Feckenham, who had heard Mary's final confession and administered her last rites, was chosen to preach the sermon. He ascended to the pulpit, looked out over the assembled mourners, and attempted to speak about the Queen he had served so faithfully. His voice broke almost immediately. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to find words adequate to the moment. Several times he had to pause, overcome with genuine grief, before continuing. He spoke of Mary's piety, her devotion to the faith, her suffering throughout her life. He reminded the congregation that she had been England's first crowned queen regnant, that she had fought against rebellion and conspiracy to claim what was rightfully hers. Whether the mourners agreed with her religious policies or not, they could not deny her courage. Some accounts suggest that Elizabeth herself attended, watching from a hidden gallery where she could observe without being seen. If true, what must she have thought, watching the elaborate Catholic ceremony her sister had died defending, knowing she would dismantle it all within months? The ceremony reached its conclusion with the actual interment. The heralds, in a traditional gesture of finality, broke their wooden staffs of office over their knees and threw the pieces into the grave after the coffin. It was meant to be a solemn, dignified moment. Instead, chaos erupted. The crowd of mourners, suddenly released from the constraints of ceremony, surged forward. They tore down the black silk hangings that had been draped throughout the abbey. They ripped armorial bearings from the walls. In the frenzy, people grabbed whatever they could as souvenirs, or simply out of mob mentality. Mary Tudor's funeral ended in disorder and near riot. It seemed a fitting metaphor for her troubled reign, beginning with such hope, ending in confusion and conflict. When Mary had drafted her will in the months before her death, she had included one deeply personal request. She wanted her mother's remains brought from Peterborough Cathedral, where Catherine of Aragon had been buried 22 years earlier. Mother and daughter, who had suffered so much together and apart, would finally rest side by side for eternity. It was perhaps the most heartfelt wish Mary had ever expressed in writing. Elizabeth's government ignored it completely. There would be no reunion of mother and daughter, no exhumation of Catherine's body, no acknowledgement of Mary's final, desperate plea to not be alone even in death. The request was simply set aside as inconvenient, expensive, and politically problematic. Why honor the wishes of a dead Catholic queen when the living Protestant queen wanted to move forward, not backward? So Mary was buried alone in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. Her lead coffin was lowered into a vault beneath the marble floor. Initially, only simple stones marked where England's first crowned queen lay. No elaborate monument, no grand inscription celebrating her achievements. Just stone and silence. For nearly 50 years, Mary rested there in unmarked obscurity while her younger sister reigned, transforming England into the Protestant nation Mary had died trying to prevent. Elizabeth became Gloriana, The Virgin Queen, good queen best celebrated, mythologized, beloved. Mary became Bloody Mary, the cautionary tale, the tyrant whose reign was best forgotten. Then, in 1603, Elizabeth herself died. And in a twist of fate that Mary might have found bitterly ironic, Elizabeth's advisors chose to bury her in the same vault as her half-sister. In 1606, Elizabeth's coffin was placed directly above Mary's in the shared tomb. But even in death, Elizabeth overshadowed her older sister completely. A magnificent white marble monument was erected over the vault, one of the most beautiful in all of Westminster Abbey. It features Elizabeth's effigy lying in regal splendor, surrounded by elaborate carvings and Latin inscriptions praising her 45-year reign. Visitors to the Abbey photograph it constantly, drawn by its grandeur and the legacy of the Queen it celebrates. Nowhere on that monument is Mary mentioned. No inscription acknowledges that another queen, the first queen, lies beneath Elizabeth's coffin. No carving honors Mary's courage in claiming the throne against overwhelming odds, or her 5-year struggle to rule in a world unprepared for female sovereignty. The monument's inscription refers only to partners, both in throne and grave, but even that cryptic reference focuses on Elizabeth as the mother of her country. Mary is rendered invisible, her very existence beneath her sister's remains unmarked and unacknowledged to casual observers. It was the final betrayal in a life filled with them. Mary had wanted to rest beside her beloved mother. Instead, she was placed beneath her rival sister for eternity. She had wanted to be remembered as England's first queen regnant who proved a woman could rule. Instead, she became a footnote beneath Elizabeth's glory, remembered primarily for the religious persecutions that earned her an infamous nickname. Even the grave offered Mary Tudor no peace, no recognition, no escape from being overshadowed and forgotten. But history has one final question to answer about Mary's tragic life. What actually killed her? What combination of diseases conspired to create the horrific suffering of her final year? For centuries after her death, historians debated what actually killed Mary Tudor. The physicians who attended her final days recorded symptoms, but had no framework to understand what they were witnessing. In the 20th and 21st centuries, medical historians finally began unraveling the mystery by examining those contemporary accounts through the lens of modern medicine. The answer, they discovered, was not a single disease, but a perfect storm of multiple conditions attacking her simultaneously. Dr. Milo Keynes, writing in 2000, argued that a pituitary tumor, specifically a prolactinoma, was the primary culprit behind many of Mary's most devastating symptoms. This type of tumor secretes prolactin, causing the phantom pregnancies that haunted her reign. The elevated prolactin would have stopped her menstrual cycles, caused her breasts to produce milk despite never giving birth, and triggered the hormonal chaos that made her body mimic pregnancy twice. As the tumor grew, it pressed against her optic nerves, gradually stealing her vision until she was completely blind in her final weeks. But the pituitary tumor alone couldn't explain everything, particularly the rapid deterioration in her final year. Other researchers pointed to evidence of cancer, likely originating in her ovaries or uterus. The massive abdominal swelling in her last months wasn't pregnancy or even tumor-induced bloating, but ascites, nearly 2 gallons of fluid accumulating because cancer had spread to her liver, destroying its ability to regulate fluid balance. The yellowing of her skin, the digestive issues, the rapid weight loss followed by grotesque swelling, all classic signs of metastatic cancer destroying her organs one by one. The blackening skin that so horrified her attendants was necrosis, likely caused by a combination of factors. Her failing circulatory system couldn't deliver adequate blood to her extremities. Infection may have invaded her compromised immune system, and the cancer itself may have been cutting off blood supply to tissues. Then there was the influenza epidemic that swept England in early 1558, killing thousands. Mary, already weakened by chronic illness, had no reserves to fight the infection. The fever that plagued her final months may have been partially viral, delivering a final blow to a body already pushed beyond endurance. And perhaps, most devastating of all, was the psychological component. Modern medicine recognizes that severe depression and chronic stress can accelerate physical decline. Mary's physicians noted that her mental anguish seemed to worsen her physical symptoms. The abandonment by Philip, the flight of her court to Elizabeth, the failure of her religious policies, the loss of Calage's psychological wound may have weakened her body as ability to fight the diseases consuming her. Mary Tudor died from a combination of pituitary tumor, likely ovarian or uterine cancer with liver metastases, influenza, and possibly complications from lifelong endometriosis. Multiple diseases struck simultaneously, each feeding on her weakness, each compounding the other's effects. She experienced nearly every moment of her body's betrayal while fully conscious. Unlike many dying of cancer today who receive morphine or other pain relief, Mary had nothing but prayer and willpower. She felt everything: the blindness creeping in, the skin blackening, the organs failing one by one. In the end, Mary Tudor's body betrayed her as completely as her husband, her court, and ultimately history itself.